The last time I reviewed anything this large and this expensive, it was your mom. 8 out of 10. Today's video is brought to you by craftcomputing.store, the letters I, P, and A, and viewers like you. Or, at least it could be. If you like the things we do here on Craft Computing, consider joining the Patreon. Every contribution helps keep power on to my lights, my server rack, and my beer fridge. Seriously, I would not be able to do the things that I do without the amazing support from my patrons. As little as $1 a month gets you exclusive access to my Discord server, which my amazing patrons from all over the world keep lively at all hours of the day. You can chat with me or the other hosts from our weekly live show, Talking Heads, or simply lurk and catch the ebb and flow of the craft computing community. Visit patreon.com/craftcomputing to sign up today. That's patreon.com/craftcomputing, and again, thanks for watching. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. This is the OneXPlayer 2, and it's a whole new breed of handheld gaming PC, though it is stretching that definition of handheld with a massive 8.4-inch IPS display. This thing is huge, making it the largest handheld in my collection, even making my Aya Neo Next feel downright pocketable. At nearly an inch thick at its slimmest point, it is not a console you're going to be able to just toss in a backpack without thinking about it. Be prepared to give up some space in your airplane carry-on in exchange for all the power that's inside. The specs on the OneXPlayer 2 are absolutely bonkers, especially when compared to consoles like the Steam Deck. At its heart, this is rocking AMD's all-new Ryzen 6800U APU. It's a 6nm Zen 3 Plus based CPU with 8 cores and 16 threads, with a base clock of 2.7 GHz and a max turbo of 4.7. The GPU on this new chip has also received a massive shot in the arm with the Radeon 680M. While this is still an APU-based chip, this is AMD's latest Navi 2-based RDNA 3 graphics core. While the Van Gogh RDNA 2 GPU in the Steam Deck was capable of 720p gaming, it lacked the needed oomph to play at any reasonable settings when docked to an external monitor. The same story goes for the Vega 2-based APU on the Ryzen 5800U used by the Aya Neo Next. While this does have a higher TDP and boost clock than the Steam Deck, it still wasn't enough to jump up to that next resolution level or increase details when plugged into an external display. But now we have this, the Ryzen 6800U, and it might just be one of those paradigm-shifting leaps, at least when it comes to handheld gaming PCs like the OneXPlayer 2. While my previous handheld PC reviews have centered around whether you could or couldn't play a game, when reviewing the OneXPlayer 2, there's not a game that I tried that didn't beat my expectations. We'll get to performance soon enough, but again, I feel portability and ergonomics are always more important when it comes to portable gaming consoles, so that feels like the most logical place to start. Do keep in mind, this is a late-stage prototype sent over by OneXPlayer for my review, so the final unit may still receive some updates, but I'll still be giving my full thoughts here on the device. Obviously, the specs for this device have to start with that 8.4-inch 2560 by 1600 IPS display and the Ryzen 9 6800U. As for the rest of this review unit, it's equipped with 16GB of LPDDR5 6400 memory and a 1TB Gen 3x4 NVMe drive. While some may balk at the idea of only using a Gen 3 SSD on the 6800U when it supports PCI Express 4.0, rest assured performance is not going to suffer one bit when it comes to gameplay. Sequential read speeds topped out at 3500 megabytes per second, with random 4K topping 560 megabytes per second. Those are impressive results, and while upgrading to Gen 4 would certainly improve raw performance, game load times or frame rates are not going to be impacted in the slightest. The M.2 slot does fully support Gen 4 as well, so if you feel the need to upgrade to a Gen 4 drive, that is certainly an option, as the drive is user serviceable. So that pretty much does it for the internals, but what about the rest of the device? Starting at the left, we have our power button, followed by what I incorrectly assumed were volume up and down, but they turned out to be programmable hotkeys for alt-tabbing to the desktop from any application and bringing up the on-screen keyboard. Unfortunately, the keyboard that is used here is the accessibility-based mouse-driven one, not the one that is designed for Windows-based tablets. I haven't found a method for customizing these buttons either, which would have been nice in software. Next up is the turbo button, which, again, doesn't do exactly what you think it should. Rather than boosting performance or maxing out your TDP settings, it brings up a menu for configuring a lot of the internal performance options. Things like device TDP, GPU and CPU frequency limits, fan speed, brightness, and volume, and probably my favorite two options, quick resolution switching, and a one-button launcher for RTSS and hardware info. Moving ahead, we've got a 3.5mm headset jack, a USB Type-C port, a USB 3 Type-A port for full-size peripherals, and a micro SD card slot for expanding your storage. The sides of the device are slotted to accept these controllers via a set of pogo pins, and I really like the design, but I am a bit disappointed at the overall feel of the controllers when everything is assembled. More on that shortly. When the controller isn't connected, the sides of the device are just left exposed, and while it doesn't really pose a problem, it's not the most attractive or polished look, especially on a device that costs $1,200. And additionally, I'd hate for the controller mount to start building up dirt and grime. Maybe a plastic cover could be included in the final version of the device for a cleaner look, or the 3D printing community could step up and handle it themselves. Either way, I'd like to see some way of making the device look a little bit more complete, with or without the controllers attached. On the bottom of the unit, we also have a second USB Type-C port. Both USB-C ports offer both power and data connections, be it for connecting peripherals or an external display. The One X2 also supports external GPU docks, though I didn't have time to test that out. There's also another set of pogo pin pads for connecting an optional keyboard on the bottom, turning the OneXPlayer 2 into one of the most overpowered and chunky netbooks that I've ever laid eyes on. But if you think about it, the 8.4-inch display is far better than the original EPCs from over a decade ago. Maybe using this as a tiny laptop isn't the craziest idea in the world. And as a fan of small form factor laptops goes, I might have to give that a go in the future. Speaking of the display, this is probably the single best feature of the One X2, aside from the raw performance. What you're looking at is an 8.4-inch 2560 by 1600 IPS panel, and outside of the OLED display offered by the iNeo Air, is probably the best looking screen I've seen in a handheld so far. Though it still is only 60 Hz, it is incredibly bright and amazingly crisp at just about any resolution. Because of the higher pixel count, if you want to step this down from 1600p to 1920 by 1200, 1680 by 1050, or even 1280 by 800, the screen still looks fantastic, with none of the usual resolution mismatch artifacts. One thing I do wish would start making an appearance in handhelds is adaptive sync technologies like FreeSync. One issue I ran into quite frequently on the One X2 was screen tearing, and with the screen having a native portrait orientation, you wind up with some gnarly looking vertical tears on the screen, which is more than a bit jarring on a screen that's this large. It does weird things to your eyes with any kind of side-scrolling action, and did take me out of wanting to play this more when VSync was not enabled. Enabling VSync does solve the issue in-game, but frame dips are far more noticeable because of tearing on higher resolution screens. It is a bit of a double-edged sword. While the screen is absolutely gorgeous, it also makes the tearing much more obvious and much more distracting at times. Moving on from the display, let's take a closer look at the controller portion of the One X2, and the inspiration is pretty obvious. The controllers mount to the side of the unit similar to the Nintendo Switch, but in this case the paddles themselves don't wirelessly function. There is a peripheral gamepad adapter for using the controllers wirelessly, though my review unit didn't seem to include that adapter, although I did see it in other review videos. I can't personally attest to the usefulness or quality, but it seems like a nice option to have. Now, as a quick aside, OneXPlayer's website does have a very misleading picture on top of the product page. Right next to Introducing OneXPlayer 2 is an image of a man wearing a suit jacket and a watch that is undoubtedly too tight, using the OneXPlayer with the optional magnetic keyboard in the tap-top mode, and he's managing some sort of flowchart? Pinboard thing, while angrily clenching the detachable paddles in his hands. This is not how these paddles work. Like I said, the paddles can be joined with the gamepad wireless adapter, but they won't work on their own like Nintendo Joy-Cons. Most of the rest of the images on the website do show the paddles being joined with the device or being used with that wireless adapter. But you have to understand what you're going to get if you purchase one of these devices, and the imagery is not necessarily selling it. Now, the OneXPlayer is large enough that you might want to just set it on your desk, on a coffee table, or on an in-flight seatback, and save your strength rather than using it in the console handheld mode. The built-in kickstand tells me this was definitely a use case they had in mind and was not an afterthought. In fact, OneXPlayer themselves boasts of 5-in-1 functionality. Of course, with the paddles in place on the handheld, you have a powerful handheld gaming PC. But if you have a USB-C docking station, you can remove the paddles and connect this to a TV or external monitor and enjoy it from afar. Or simply set the device on a desk and have a slightly more mobile experience, assuming you have the wireless gamepad adapter. Now, at its heart, it is still a handheld, so maybe you just want to hold this thing in your hands. And I will say, it's not necessarily uncomfortable, but perhaps it's just lacking the polished ergonomics of the Steam Deck. It's totally serviceable though, given its size and weight. The controller on the One X2 features a standard Xbox-style layout, with a pair of offsetting joysticks, a D-pad, and a set of ABXY buttons. Start and select are near the top of the controller and are very easily reachable without adjusting your grip on the controller. There are a pair of buttons under the right joystick that appear to be for controlling the LEDs or maybe even the screen brightness, but at this time, they don't appear to be doing anything. Maybe that'll be fixed later in software. And finally, there's also a dedicated Xbox button for bringing up the Xbox game bar in Windows. It might not seem like that big of a deal, but I often use game bar add-ons when playing games, and it's a button that I dearly miss on some of my other handhelds. Both the joysticks and the triggers on the One X2 use Hall effect sensors to increase both accuracy and longevity of the controls. It also comes with the added benefit of having much smaller dead zones. Unlike the review unit that was sent to Linus Tech Tips, my unit does appear to be calibrated correctly, and the input is detected with very little movement of the joysticks at all. What's not so great is basically all of the rest of the controller. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not the worst thing that I've ever used, but in my opinion it falls well short of most other handhelds that I've reviewed. The triggers and the shoulder buttons in particular are made of some pretty inexpensive plastics, and have an audible squeak from the springs when depressing them. While responsive enough, they don't feel premium like they should on a $1,200 handheld. The same goes for the ABXY buttons. They just feel a little mushy and unpredictable, and it's not something that I'd expect to find on a device that costs as much as the OneXPlayer does. Testing against other handhelds that I own, the controller as a whole just feels subpar. Given devices like the Neo Next also have Hall effect controls on both the joysticks and the triggers, have much higher quality components, and just feel more premium, I can't help but feel disappointed overall. That being said, one of the things I love about this device is that you can just remove the controls altogether and attach your own via Bluetooth. Now, while I did the majority of my testing using the One X2's controllers, and they would certainly be more than adequate when traveling, I did all of my benchmarking on the One X using its kickstand and either my Xbox One Elite or my Gully Kit Hall effect controller connected. If you wanted to use the One X2 as a gaming tablet with a controller in tow, this is totally a valid use case. Given the power inside of the One X2, with its Ryzen 9 6800U 8-core CPU and 680M graphics, it's reasonable some people may be doing some more general computing on here than on other dedicated gaming handhelds. I know it's a bit odd that one of my favorite features is that you can remove the subpar controllers, but tossing the One X2 into a travel bag, along with a controller or two for multiplayer gaming, and a compact keyboard and mouse, along with a set of Nreal Air glasses for larger viewing, you might just be able to leave your laptop at home. Also, for a handheld device, the battery life on this thing is absolutely astounding. Now, OneXPlayer themselves boasts a whopping 3 to 6 hours of gameplay depending on the intensity of the games that are being played. And I totally believe that. While I never got 6 hours, I easily got over 3 on some more modern games. If you remember my reviews of both Neo devices, the Next was able to squeak out between 2 and 3 hours running at 720p 60Hz off of a 15-watt power draw, while the Air couldn't even get that at a measly 5-watt TDP. Now, while the Neo Air does have a gorgeous 1080p OLED display, its battery is only a 28 watt-hour, which means very limited game time if you were running that thing full bore. Think 90 minutes at best and around an hour at worst. The One X2, on the other hand, has a massive 65.5 watt-hour battery. To put this to the test, I fired up Kingdom Come Deliverance at 720p, which is a game that I could not run on any other handheld at a decent tick. Setting the TDP down to just 12 watts and with the screen brightness set to 75%, I managed 2 hours and 45 minutes of battery life while running the game at a solid 40 FPS. OneXPlayer's website boasts that you can play GTA 5 locked at 60 FPS for up to 4 hours, so I put that exact claim to the test. At a 10 watt TDP and normal settings in game, we also set the draw distance and variety sliders up to max. And I got an amazing 3 hours and 40 minutes of playtime, and the game had no problem holding 60 FPS the entire time. Any handheld that has enough battery life to get me through an entire flight is a winner in my book, and the One X2 might even have some juice left over after you land. So overall, a solid device with middling ergonomics and controllers, but a best-in-class display and outstanding battery life. The specs on paper at least might make this the console to beat when it comes to performance, but does all that horsepower actually put rubber to the road? Let's find out. Starting with one of the more difficult titles to run on a handheld, Cyberpunk 2077 left me literally in awe of how well it ran. At 1280 by 800, we managed 49 FPS on average with a 1% low of 28. To put that into perspective, at 28 FPS, the One X2 would have beaten out the GPD Win 3 and fallen just short of the Aya Neo Air and Aya Neo Next handhelds running at 15 watt TDPs, as they scored just 32 and 34 FPS respectively. At a 20 watt TDP, the Aya Neo Next did manage 42 FPS, but still had 1% lows down in the teens. In fact, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned handhelds traditionally don't have enough power to connect to an external monitor and game at 1080p. That changes today, with the One X2 scoring 47 FPS on average with a 1% low of 29 when running at a full 28 watt TDP and a resolution of 1920 by 1200. Let's just say I'm impressed with these results, and the performance kept getting better from here. One of the most exciting aspects of the One X2, besides the performance, was the battery life claims. 4 hours of GTA 5 at 1080p and 60 FPS? Not only did I confirm those results, but turning the TDP up to 20 watts also resulted in a 0.1% low of just 41, making GTA 5 one of the most consistent games in the test suite when it came to frame times. Sure, settings were still set to normal, but the distance sliders were maxed out to take full advantage of the GPU memory cap. For a game that's 10 years old this year, it's still one of the most popular to play online today, and you'd have no issues with performance if you wanted to make GTA Online a handheld experience. This is another incredibly demanding title that has performed so poorly on handhelds that I've tested in the past, I've not included it in any of my final benchmarks. At 5 years old, and holding more firmly than ever onto its cult classic status, Kingdom Come Deliverance absolutely blew me away on the One X2. At a resolution of 1280 by 800, and again at just 20 watt TDP, this title easily averaged 60 FPS at low settings, and managed a 1% low of just 35. What's more is the view distance was still turned up to max settings, and on the 8.4-inch screen did not suffer visually in any way. 5 years on, this is still a gorgeous game, and definitely worth a look now that you can play it on a handheld. Racing fans, I'm sure, are going to be eager to take full advantage of the Hall effect triggers and joysticks on the One X2, and Project Cars 3 is not going to leave them disappointed. At a full 1920 by 1200 resolution and medium settings, we cruise to an easy 58 FPS on average, with even the 0.1% low staying well above 30. This was an incredibly smooth experience overall, and while I'm still a bit down on the physical controls on the device, the triggers and joysticks were still responsive enough to give an overall great experience here. Unlike GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the more difficult titles to run, especially on handheld PCs. But much to my surprise, the One X2 managed 55 FPS on average with a 1% low of just 36, making it not only playable, but incredibly enjoyable in a handheld for the first time. Now, we are still at a resolution of 1280 by 800, and viewing the screen capture on a 27-inch monitor isn't doing it any favors. But again, at 8.4 inches, those fuzzy details just blended in and made for an overall excellent experience. Need a little more fast-paced action? Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has been one of my favorite shooters over the last year, and runs nearly flawlessly on the One X2, averaging an even 60 FPS with a 1% low of 32 when playing at 1280 by 800. I did attempt to bump this game up to 1200p at that 20 watt TDP setting, but that dropped our average frame rate down to 38 FPS. Still playable, but the lows and the frame drops were much more noticeable at the higher resolution. If the Wonderlands are on your playlist, I'd recommend sticking to an 800p resolution, or keeping a power cable close at hand. Who doesn't like a little wanton destruction in their lives? Wreckfest is one of my favorite games to lose an hour or two in, and it's especially easy to do on the One X2. Even at 1920 by 1200, we easily manage 60 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 45 and a 0.1% low of just 39. Even the most critical eyes in the PCMR subreddit would have a hard time finding fault here, with the 8.4-inch IPS display putting on an absolute show when it came to the crispy visuals and plumes of fire. 10 out of 10, highly recommended you spend some time in this Destruction Derby simulator if the One X2 makes its way into your hands. To wrap things up, we'll take a quick look at emulation on the Ryzen 6800U, and it should be no surprise that it again tops the charts when it comes to handhelds. At 1080p, Breath of the Wild on the CEMU emulator averaged 60 FPS and managed a 0.1% low of just 33, and that's even without shaders being fully cached yet after a fresh install. Anytime you're able to more than double up performance on a native console through emulation, you're doing pretty well indeed. To put it mildly, I was absolutely blown away by the performance of the Ryzen 6800U in the OneXPlayer 2 in nearly every game that I tested, with multiple titles hitting 60 FPS, not just at 1280 by 800, but also 1920 by 1200, gaming on a handheld PC is about to be much less about compromise and more about overall experience. With a best-in-class display and the power to drive it, the OneXPlayer 2 is definitely the handheld to beat, and that's in spite of the subpar controller quality. It's not entirely perfect, and I did experience a couple growing pains with the Ryzen 680M graphics. Breath of the Wild had some shimmering issues with the water that I'd not seen before, and the Xenia emulator crashed immediately upon any 3D graphics being rendered, but those are likely issues that will be sorted out by driver or software updates in the near future. If it wasn't obvious, despite a couple shortcomings, the OneXPlayer 2 is one of the most impressive handhelds that I've reviewed thus far. One surefire way to gain an edge in an enthusiast-centric market is to blow away performance expectations from enthusiasts. It's not a cheap product, it's not the most portable or ergonomic handheld, and I definitely have some quality concerns around the controllers and the way they mount onto the main body. But there's also no denying that the OneXPlayer 2 has performance in spades for those looking for it, and the age of the 1080p capable handheld PC may finally be upon us. With a starting price of $1,100 and $1,200 as reviewed, this is not going to be for everyone. But for those looking to avoid compromises when it comes to performance, the OneXPlayer 2 nicely fills a gap between gaming handhelds and gaming laptops, and might actually be a launching off point for some gamers who were looking for a handheld package. If you are interested in picking up the OneXPlayer 2 for yourself, I will have links down in the video description. The Indiegogo campaign for OneXPlayer has since ended, but you can pre-order directly from their website, and I will have Amazon links up as soon as they are available. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. Follow me on Mastodon for daily shenanigans like this, and if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in what I do, consider joining the Patreon. Link is also down in the video description. That's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone. Beer for today is from Three Notch Brewing Company. It is the Bourbon Barrel Biggie S'mores Stout, clocking in at 10.8%. Beer for me, beer for Rhett. Look at that. I know. I give and I give. Let me just say, there's a reason you barrel age things. And often it's to get a little bit of that oak note, a little bit of like a rye or a bourbon kicker. In this one, the bourbon takes center stage, and it is oh so good. It is definitely an interesting mix with the bourbon barrel and the s'more inspiration on this. There's definitely a graham cracker and marshmallow type flavor, and it's just velvety smooth, mixed with the chocolate in the stout, but then drizzle it with bourbon. This is one of the best beers I've had in a while, and that's saying something.